Welcome back to Learning Hebrew. We are on Chapter 7, which is the perfect tense. So right now we are getting into verbs in depth, and we're going to be exploring the perfect tense this week. As usual, we will start off with the vocabulary. In the first column, we have the following words. We have the verb achal, which is eat, amar, say. We have the subject pronoun anachnu. We also have ani or anochi, which is I. We have at with a shava, which is you, feminine singular, and we have ata, which is you, masculine singular. We also have atem, which is you, masculine plural, second person masculine plural. We also have aten, which is second person feminine plural. We have the verb yashav, sit, settle, reside. Lo, which is a negative, no or not, is usually how it's translated. Lechem, which is bread or food. Lifnei, before or in front of. Lakach, which is take. And al, upon, about, on, over, is usually how that's going to be translated. So that's the vocabulary for this chapter. On to subject pronouns. So we now know all of these subject pronouns, and this chart is right from the book on page 51. So here you'll see how this is organized. This is actually structured the same way that verb patterns are going to be shown in this chapter and in subsequent chapters. We have on the right column, first person singular. Another way this is referred to, since first person in Hebrew does not have gender, it's neither masculine or feminine, it's basically both. Another way we use this, rather than saying first person masculine, feminine, singular, is just saying first person common, singular and plural, is how I was taught it. So if you hear me say that, that's why, because there's not a gender attached to this pronoun. So first person common singular is ani or anochi. Second person masculine singular ata. Second person feminine at. Third person masculine hu. Third person feminine he. And again, these are all going to be familiar because by you get to this chapter, you know all the subject pronouns. We also have first person common plural, anachnu. We have second person masculine plural, atem, second person feminine plural, aten, third person masculine plural, heim or hema, and third person feminine plural, hena. And we're going to come back to these in just a second. But first, we're going to talk about the perfect tense of what's called the pa'al pattern. So in Hebrew, there are several different patterns. They're also called stems. I usually call them stems, because that's how I learned it, and it just helps me to better understand it. And these patterns each have different forms of perfect and imperfect tense construction. So the main stem, the most common stem, is the pa'al stem. It's also called the kal stem. So if you're ever looking in other resources and you see this, the QAL, it's referring to this stem, which we're about to learn, and which we really already have learned in some ways. And again, it's the most common and is also the easiest to work with. So this is what the pattern of the pa'al stem looks like. And again, I tend to use pattern to refer to verb charts, which I'm about to put up. So that's why I usually call what the book refers to as verb patterns. I usually just call them stems, because I call these patterns. But again, that's just sort of a difference in how I refer to things, so I hope that doesn't get confusing going forward. But this is the perfect tense of the pa'al stem, and it looks like this. This is also from the book on page 52. And whenever we go over new verb charts, it's going to use the root verb shamar, and that's just because shamar is the most is one of the most consistent verbs in Hebrew. So it's going to showcase the rules more consistently than a lot of other verbs. Plus, it's a pretty basic verb and common enough that it's a good one to know anyways. And before I go in depth with this, which I'm really not going to go that in depth with, I just want to bring back the subject pronoun chart, because you'll notice here that the endings of the subject pronouns mirror the endings of the verb forms. So for instance, the first person common singular verb form, which of shamar in the Pa'al pattern perfect tense is shamarti, has the same ending as the subject pronoun for first person common singular, that hirik yod ending, so that E sound. And you're going to notice that in the verb chart. And the rest of these are pretty much the same. They're very consistent. So second person masculine singular, that ta ending, the tav with the comets, it's the same in the subject pronoun. And you also have the second person feminine singular at. Well, you have that same construction here, although in the verb form it's pronounced different because you have the double shava going on. So this is actually pronounced shamar ta, whereas this is just pronounced at. And obviously, once you get to the third person singular and plural, the rules kind of change a little bit. It's not that consistent, but it is easier to recognize third person verbs because these are the ones we've already gone over in the previous chapters. The ones up here are different for us, but the endings should give them away what they're referring to. So the first person common plural, the ending is nu, which is the same sound and same form as anachnu, which is the first person common plural. Also, second person masculine plural, tem, mirrors the second person plural subject pronoun atem, or atem, sorry, gotta do the accents, as well as the second person feminine plural ten, which here the subject pronoun aten. So I'm going to go through, I'm just going to read these so you get the sound, and it is good to go over verbs and go through the pronunciation because you'll notice certain patterns and some similarities in how you pronounce them. So I'm just going to go through. Shamarti, shamarta, shamarta, shamar, shamra, shamarnu, shamartem, shamarten, shamru, and shamru. Now, on the face of it, since this is the first time we're looking at these, it might not seem that significant to go over the pronunciation. But once we start learning more verbs and more verb stems, the pronunciation is going to help out a lot, especially if you're able to actually say it out loud. Sometimes just saying it out loud will help you be able to differentiate one verb type from another. So this is the perfect tense of the Pa'al stem. And this is just a point of clarification that every verb root that we've already learned fits into this pattern. In fact, almost all the verbs we're going to learn in this book have a Pa'al stem variation. Not all the verbs. Some verbs only appear in a different verb stem, but we'll get into that in later chapters. But all the verbs that we've learned, and most all the verbs we're ever going to learn in this book, are going to have a Pa'al stem perfect tense pattern that's going to follow very similar rules to what we just learned. And since this chapter is the first chapter that deals directly with verbs, and verbs, no matter what language you're working with, can get pretty complicated. It takes a while to get used to how they're constructed and how they function. This chapter ends with this section that we're going to look at right here, which is negative sentences. So sentences are usually made negative in Hebrew by using the word lo. So these are the examples that the book gives. So we have this sentence here, Avraham halach el ha'ir, which is Abraham walked to the city. Well, if you want to make that negative, we just add the word lo to it. So Avraham lo halach el ha'ir. Abraham did not walk to the city. We have this sentence here, Amadnu baderech, which is we walked on the road. By now you should notice that this beit is acting as a preposition to the word derech. And you'll also notice that it is a definite word because the bait does not have a shiva underneath. Instead, it has a patak, which should clue you into the fact that there's something else going on here. And of course, what's going on here is that the bait is replacing a definite hey and taking on that definite hey's vowel. So this is not we walked on a road, this is we walked on the road. But if you want to make that negative, lo amadnu baderech, which is we did not walk on the road. So I do want to point out here that with Hebrew verbs, and this is something we already touched on, but I'm just coming back to it, Hebrew verbs can have both the subject and the verb within its verb structure. So you'll notice here there is no subject pronoun we. You just have the verb form that includes we, first person common plural, with the nu ending. It's not anachnu amadnu baderek. It's just amadnu baderek. So you don't need the subject pronoun to know what the subject of the sentence is. And the subject of the sentence is we. And you know that because of how the verb is constructed. So that is going over negative sentences. A fairly simple rule, and one that is only complicated by the fact that there is another word that is a negative, but that affects how imperfect verbs are treated, and we'll get into that in future chapters. And that's going to conclude this chapter on the perfect tense. And again, there are not a lot of different rules or different language devices being taught in this chapter, simply because learning the perfect tense of the pa'al pattern is going to be enough work to get used to. So I would recommend doing exercises 3, 5, 6, 8, and 11. And at the end of this chapter, you're actually competent enough in the Hebrew language that they included a short story at the end of the chapter. And from now on, each chapter is going to end with a short story, or sometimes I'll call them tall tales, which that's the most common way that they'll refer to them. And they're actually pretty good. I would recommend it. They do include a lot of repetition, which on the one hand can feel kind of boring, but on the other hand, it gets your mind used to recognizing these words without having to stop and look at every single syllable. You'll just get used to seeing them. You'll get used to seeing certain Hebrew constructions and how sentences flow. And so every chapter I'm going to recommend, along with doing the oral review at the beginning of the chapter, doing the tall tale at the end. And that is going to conclude this chapter. The next chapter is chapter 8, which is the direct object. And I'm actually going to be taking a break for a couple weeks. I'm going to be gone. So the next video will not come out until probably the end of the month, if I can get one out that soon. Otherwise, I will see you when the next video comes out, which will be chapter 8 on the direct object. So until next time.